Rejected by all, a fat girl married a poor outsider. But the man the villagers mocked carried a truth none of them could imagine. He was the secret son of the chief himself. In the quiet and dusty village of Andamba, everyone knew Jamila's name. They said it often, but never with kindness. To the men, she was air, something unseen, something they stepped past without notice. To the women, she was a walking joke, a reminder of what they thought was shameful. To the children, she was the easiest target, someone they could laugh at freely because no one would ever stop them. For as long as anyone remembered, Jamila had been the girl people agreed would never be chosen, the one they believed would wither away in loneliness. But life has a way of turning when no one expects it. One day, out of nowhere, a man with no name and no past appeared. He had no horse, no bag, no gift, just dust on his sandals, weariness in his step, and a silence that followed him like a cloak. He asked for nothing more than water, yet when his eyes met Jamila's, something shifted inside him, and with that look he decided to stay. No one could believe what came next. The unthinkable happened. This outsider asked Jamila to marry him. The village erupted with laughter, mocking and scorn. But what no one knew was that this quiet stranger carried a secret that could shake the roots of leadership itself, and that Jamila, the woman despised and dismissed, was the only key to unlocking a truth the chief had buried for years. But before that secret would rise, before anyone could see what fate was weaving, we must return to Jamila's life as it was. A life where rejection had become a daily ritual, as familiar to her as breath itself. Jamila always woke before the light touched the horizon. The rooster would still be quiet, the air cool, and she would already be sweeping the porch, setting water to boil, and preparing the porridge dough. Every movement was careful, almost sacred, as if her routine was the only thing holding her together. But behind the rhythm of her hands lived a deep weariness, not of body, but of spirit. Because in Andamba, to be a woman was already heavy, and to be a woman big in body, big in laughter, big in hope, that was treated as a sin. At the well, where the women gathered, Jamila never found company. The moment she approached, others would step away, moving aside as though her presence carried disease. Even on the hottest days, when the sun pressed down hard and the bucket cut into her palms like iron, she stood alone. It was easier to wait her turn than to hear the sneering comments. Even her shadow needs more room, they would whisper, chuckling as though cruelty were a form of entertainment. The children were no gentler. They had already learned the language of mockery. They would dash past her shouting, "Whoever marries Jamila turns into a pumpkin," and then they would collapse into laughter, proud of their joke as if they had discovered treasure. Jamila tried to be seen. She wrapped her head in a clean scarf, pressed her skirt smooth with hot coals, and forced a smile onto her lips. But her efforts were met with silence. No man's eyes lingered on her. No teasing glances, no greetings, no gentle words. Nothing but the dry silence of a verdict already passed. Jamila was not worthy, and worse than being mocked was being ignored, being treated as though she did not exist at all. In the deepest hours of the night when her parents slept, Jamila wept into her straw mattress. Her sobs came slow and muffled, the kind of crying that rises from the belly, heavy and nameless. She wept for every word she wanted to speak but swallowed instead, for every dress she wore that was never complimented, for every glance that never came her way. And yet, with the crow of the rooster, she forced her smile back into place, stitched across her face like an embroidery too old to undo. She greeted her family with cheer, cooked with patience, and served with kindness, even to those who pretended not to hear her greetings. Her mother, always trying to soften the edges of her daughter's pain, whispered, "God has his ways, and he never leaves a daughter unanswered." But her eyes betrayed her fear. The fear every mother carries when she sees her daughter does not fit the mold the world demands. Her father spoke little, yet his silence carried weight. Sometimes he looked at her, then looked away, shaking his head, already resigned to the thought that his daughter's life might pass, unloved, unwedded, childless, forgotten. The years dragged on. With each passing day, Jamila's hope shrank. She stopped praying for love. She stopped imagining wedding dresses or rings. She only asked for peace, for the mercy of walking through the square without being humiliated. She no longer dreamed of dancing in celebration. She dreamed instead of a space where no one would tell her to hide. No one would look at her like she ruined the view. Yet even with her heart worn thin, she remained generous. She brought medicine to the sick, sewed clothes for her nieces, and shared bread even when she had only one piece left. And still no one chose her. Her kindness, instead of softening hearts, began to bother people. For in a place where many wore masks, someone real, someone genuine, became a threat. It was in this world of hidden loneliness, cruel laughter, and tired hope that change began. Not with noise, not with miracles, but with the slow, steady steps of a man who arrived unannounced. Evening came dressed in copper light, and he appeared like a shadow that did not ask permission. No one saw from where he came or why he had chosen Ndamba, a village forgotten, surrounded by red dust and secrets buried deep. He came with nothing but a steady gaze and the weight of the road upon his shoulders. Jamila was in the yard, her rough hands busy grating cassava, when she saw him for the first time. His eyes met hers, calm, steady, without urgency or pity. It was as if his gaze spoke words no one else had ever dared to say. "I see you." In that brief exchange, something stirred inside her. It was not passion. It was not a miracle. It was simply humanity. He asked for water. Just water. His voice was low, respectful, carrying no demands. Jamila rose, filled a gourd from the clay pot, and offered it with both hands, as though handing him more than a drink. He accepted, drinking slowly, like someone who understood the value of small gifts. Then he looked toward the darkening sky, whispered, "Thank you," and said no more. The villagers dismissed him. The men muttered that he looked like a thief. The women whispered that any man walking alone with no past must be hiding shame. But Jamila saw something different. When she noticed he still stood there, unsure where to go, she quietly pointed to the bench beneath the mango tree. "You can sit," she said. "The sky is beautiful for those who know how to wait." That night, she invited him to eat. Nothing rich, just boiled corn and plain beans, cooked with the quiet care of someone who knows how to serve with dignity. He ate slowly, reverently, in silence. He asked for nothing more, shared no story, asked no question. But his presence brought peace, a stillness rare in the world. Jamila's father watched quietly from the corner, neither welcoming nor rejecting. Her mother murmured prayers under her breath, worried that this man might be hiding some danger. But Jamila, for the first time in her life, was not afraid. She felt something she could not name. Presence. Not love, not affection, but the undeniable sense of finally being seen. In the days that followed, he stayed. He slept on the porch, helped with small tasks, carried firewood, swept the yard, mended the fence with his rough hands. Always silent, always steady. The village whispered, wondering why he had not left. But no one dared to ask him. The children mocked him as they had mocked Jamila, calling him the fat girl's thief, throwing stones when they thought no one saw. But he did not answer. His silence was his shield, and in his eyes lived a firmness that silenced their cruelty more than any word could. Jamila, watching from a distance, felt something she had never known before, the comfort of not being alone. One afternoon, while she bent over the river washing clothes, he came to her with a fish in his hands. "For dinner," he said simply. Nothing more. She took it, thanked him, and he walked away. But in that small, dry gesture lived a kind of care she had never received. No one had ever brought her anything. No one had ever thought of her quietly, without asking for something in return. From then on, he remained. Not like a guest who waits for permission, but like someone who had already found where he belonged. And Jamila, who had lived a life of shrinking, slowly lifted her shoulders and walked taller. The villagers did not try to understand. They preferred their gossip. They said he was bewitched, cursed, or running from a crime. But Jamila asked nothing. She demanded nothing. She offered only a plate, a clean cloth, a quiet smile. And he, with his silence, returned it all in his gestures. Sometimes, in the fading light of day, they sat beneath the mango tree, saying nothing, watching the sky turn. And in those silences lived more truth than in all the words Jamila had heard in years. For those who carry rejection in their bones can always recognize it in another. And together, in that quiet, they found an old kind of healing. The stranger had no name, no told story. But slowly, piece by piece, he stitched something the villagers could not see. A new way of looking at Jamila. And she, without knowing how, began to breathe differently. It wasn't love yet. It was something rarer. Respect, and for someone who had always been the butt of every joke that was worth more than any pretty word. On the morning of the third day, while dew still dripped from the broad leaves and the breeze carried the sweet scent of freshly lit firewood, he approached Jamila's father. He came without hesitation, like someone holding a certainty that needed no explanation. Old Dome, seated in the shade of the porch, barely had time to lift his eyes. The stranger, with a firm and quiet voice, simply said, "I want Jamila as my wife." The silence that followed was a stunned stillness, as if the words had come from a world where such a thing wasn't possible. Jamila's father gripped his pipe tighter, as if needing something to hold on to. Her mother, listening from the kitchen, dropped her wooden spoon on the floor. Neither of them answered right away, because until that moment, no one had ever asked for Jamila. She was the good daughter, the helper, the one who cared for her siblings, who sewed in silence, but never ever the daughter someone would choose. The news spread quickly. Within hours, the whole village was talking more laughing than shocked. Mary Jamila must be under a spell. Is he out of his mind? Is it a curse from the gods or some herb magic? The jokes multiplied like ants on honey. And strangely, this time they didn't even hide them. They said it out loud right in front of her, laughing, pointing as if the absurdity of the union gave them permission to stop pretending to be decent. Jamila didn't cry, nor did she smile. She just stayed silent. A heavy silence, but not an empty one. It was as if a door had opened inside her, not to joy, but to fear. Because when you've spent a lifetime being rejected, even love can be frightening. And more than that, she knew nothing from that moment forward would be normal. The village wouldn't allow her to live in peace. Her mother cried, but it wasn't a cry of joy. It was bitter, anxious like someone sensing a storm. She embraced her daughter in the dark of night and whispered, "My daughter, sometimes love comes in disguise, but sometimes deception comes with clean hands. Be watchful." She didn't doubt her daughter. She doubted the world. Dombey, the father, stared at the ground for a long time before responding to the request. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, tired. "If that's what you want, she's yours." There was no blessing, no prayer, just a knot caught in everyone's throat. The wedding took place in their own yard. No party, no music, no guests, just the three of them, him, her, and the father as witness. Jamila wore the same cotton dress she had worn the previous Sunday. The stranger wore a simple tunic, clean but plain. There were no flowers, no veil, only the wind rustling the thatched roof and the curious eyes of neighbors peeking through cracked windows. After that day, the mockery took on a new tone. It wasn't just laughter anymore. It became scorn. Some women spat on the ground as Jamila walked by. Others called her fat witch behind her back. The children laughed and pointed as if now they had doubled the reason to tease. And the men who once ignored her now looked at her with restrained anger, as if she had dared to steal something that didn't belong to her. But Jamila didn't flinch. She didn't explain. She didn't ask for understanding. She simply carried on, holding hands with the man everyone called mad, lost, deceived, and maybe he was. But he looked at her with that strange calm, that quiet strength no one else had ever shown her, as if the whole world was speaking. But he only listened to her heart, and with that gaze he led her into a new life far from the eyes that judged, not to a palace or a neat little house, but to an old shack hidden among trees, where the floor was packed dirt and the roof wept on rainy nights. Even so, for Jamila it was the first home she entered as someone chosen, not a guest, as a wife, not a maid. And amid the public humiliation, the collective ridicule, there was something no one saw. A seed being planted, a seed of mutual respect, of silent courage, of a love that begins without an audience. Because in that moment, Jamila still didn't know. But the man she welcomed, and who now took her as his wife, carried with him an old secret, buried deep beneath the very roots of the village. And that simple wedding, without music or praise, would be the spark that would send the truth racing through the corridors of power. The same truth that for so long had been smothered by shame, fear, and lies. But for now all she had was the firm grip of his hand, and that in that instant was more than she had ever imagined having. The road to the cabin was made of red dirt, worn down by time and absence. Only those who had lost everything ever found that place, surrounded by sparse brush, smelling of fold wood, and holding the kind of silence that keeps secrets. The hut where Ja came to live with the stranger wasn't big nor beautiful. It was a shelter, and for someone who had spent a lifetime being pushed out of people's sight and hearts, having a place where no one pointed fingers was a kind of miracle. At the entrance, the roof sagged like it was tired of holding up the sky. The packed dirt floor creaked underfoot. The windows barely closed, and the wind blew through the cracks freely, whistling like it, too, lived there. But in that simplicity, Jamila saw room to plant hope. She cleaned every corner as if she was sweeping away the sorrow the world had. Handed her, she washed the cloths, scrubbed the walls, lit the fire with steady hands. Every gesture was a fresh start, not for others, for herself. The stranger remained silent. He didn't make declarations of love, didn't bring flowers, didn't say sweet things. But every day before the sun rose, he was already on the trail. He always returned with something in his hands. A fresh fish, a handful of roots, a bundle of firewood. He never came back empty-handed, never. And for Ja, that was more than a sign of crit, was a kind of respect she had never known. There were days when the fatigue hit hard, when her body ached and her chest felt heavy. But the moment she saw that man sit on the ground to clean his knife or blow on the fire beside her, the discouragement faded. He didn't talk about the future, didn't promise riches, but he shared the present with honesty. And for someone who had lived on the margins, that was everything. She started embroidering at night, simple cloth, fine thread. She stitched flowers that didn't grow in the fields, but lived in her memory. She embroidered while he sharpened his knife or carved pieces of wood in silence. Their relationship wasn't built on long talks, but on small gestures that little by little stitched trust between them. There was a rhythm there made of pauses, glances, and sharing. No rush, Nodemans. Jamila no longer feared the village whispers. She no longer walked the streets to hear laughter or catch sideways glances. Her life was different, now quiet, simple, but full of a worth only she and he understood. And even when the wind carried voices from the village, mockery tossed in her direction. She simply lowered her eyes and kept sweeping the yard, as if to say without words, "You don't know what it is to live with dignity. I do." There was a day when it rained hard. Water came in through the side of the cabin, and they spent the night collecting it in pots, patching leaks, drying cloths. And still at the end of the night they sat together, shared a plate of warm porridge, and laughed a timid laugh, barely there, but one that said, "We're here together." She rarely asked questions, never demanded to know where he came from, or why he chose to stay. But sometimes on quieter nights, she would rest her embroidery on her lap and murmur, "Why did you choose me?" And he, with the same calm tone, always answered with the same words, "Because you looked at me like I was a person, and that was enough." Because no one had ever said that to her. No one. Jamila learned to cook the fish the way he liked, and he started placing dried flowers beside her pillow. Small things. But for someone who had never received anything, small gestures become entire worlds. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was real life, day by day, built with patience. There were no promises, only presence. And even without an "I love you," there was tenderness in every shared silence. Little by little, the shack began to feel like a home. The dust settled more gently. The brush around it was cleared, and the smell of beans on the stove announced that life lived there, the kind that endures. And it was this quiet resilience, this unspoken peace that began to bother those watching from afar. Because deep down, everyone expected Jamila's marriage to fail, for the stranger to leave her, for her to return humiliated. But she didn't return. And he didn't leave. And it was in that hideaway of clay and dignity that something began to take root. Not an instant miracle, but a subtle strength built on respect, surrender, and routine. And no one knew yet, not even Jamila, that it was precisely there in the place everyone looked down on that the greatest turning point in would be born. Because truth, when it wants to come out, doesn't choose a palace, it chooses a heart, and hers for the first time was ready. The nights in Dumbumber were long, especially deep in the forest. The sound of crickets, the croaking of frogs, the wind whistling through the cracks in the cabin. All of it seemed more intense. At first, Jamila had trouble sleeping. Herbity would settle on the mat, but her mind wandered far. It wandered the corridors of doubt, bumping into questions she didn't dare ask out loud. Who was this man? Why had he chosen to live there by her side without demanding, without fleeing? Was it love, gratitude, pity, or was there something? She still didn't know. He, as always, said little. Worked all day with quiet dedication, helped in the garden, fished, fixed parts of the house with patience. He wasn't one for hugs or sweet words, but he'd plate her food when she got distracted, and he'd take the laundry down if it rained suddenly. Small actions that, in J-World, meant more than poetry. One night, the weather turned. Lightning tore across the sky and the rain came down in fury. Jamila woke with a fever. Her body burned. Her forehead dripped sweat. Her lips were dry. She tried to stand but fell back onto the straw mattress. The world spun. And then, like in a dream, she saw him approach. He said nothing, just knelt beside her, soaked a cloth and placed it on her forehead. He stayed there all night, sitting on the floor, swatting mosquitoes, changing the water basin, watching her breathe like someone guarding a treasure. When morning came, Jamila opened her eyes and saw him still there, tired, dark circles under his eyes, but present. And in that instant, she knew he didn't need to say he loved her, because only someone who loves stays through another's weakness with such care. A few days later, they sat together on the porch. The sky was overcast. The wind rustled dry leaves, and as if time had saved that moment, Jamila asked in a soft voice, "Why did you choose me?" He stayed silent for several long seconds, then answered with his usual simplicity, "Because you looked at me like I was a person." And she felt her eyes fill. Because for the first time, someone was telling her she had worth not for being pretty or useful or obedient, but for being human. Over time, the two began to share more than chores. They shared memories. She spoke of school days when she was always the last to be chosen for anything. She told him about the pain of seeing other girls get married, get compliments, get invited to parties while she stayed behind with the pots and leftovers. Hella stand in silence, eyes fixed on her as if storing every word. And when she stopped, he would say, "That doesn't define you." He began carving small wooden figures, nimbles, trees, faces. One day he handed her a sculpture of a woman sitting with a calm face and a bent body like someone carrying the world. "It's you," he said, and she held it like holding her own heart. No one had ever turned her into art before. Jamila, who had never seen herself as beautiful, began to see herself differently in their reflection of a water basin. Not because her body had changed, but because his gaze made everything around her change, and that unsettled those nearby. Some of the women who used to mock her now spoke in warning tones. "Careful, Jamila. A man who talks little lies a lot." Others said he was using her, that he must be hiding something, that there was no way a man like him could love a woman like her. But Jamila no longer listened with the same ears. She listened with her heart, and in her heart there was peace. Of course, the doubts didn't vanish overnight. Sometimes when he disappeared into the woods for hours, she wondered if he'd come back. When he got too quiet, she feared he was hiding something. But day after day he showed through actions that his presence was a choice. And for her that was new. That was sacred. They built routines that belonged only to them. Sharing bread in the morning, walking to the stream, a moment of silence before sleep. And in these small rituals, love began to take shape without spectacle, without vows, without drama. A love made of constancy, the kind that doesn't dazzle outsiders, but warms the soul of those living it. Jamila, who had spent years believing she would never be enough for anyone, now felt that heaven with all her wounds, she was a choice. And that feeling didn't come from flowers or promises, but from gestures, a shared meal, a fever tendered, a lovingly carved piece of wood. The village kept whispering, but she was no longer the same. And the love, that love born out of ridicule, was now beginning to bloom in the forest, quiet, faithful, resilient, like everything with deep roots. The sun was still high when the firm footsteps of armed men echoed along the narrow path leading to Jamila's hut. Dust rose in small clouds, and the wind seemed to hold its breath. The village had fallen still. Everyone knew something big was about to happen, but no one dared to say it out loud. And there they were, the village chief, clad in garments marked by authority, flanked by two men with spears and tense faces. The chief's eyes burned like smothered embers, and his presence, once feared for the wrongs it concealed, now carried the discomfort that only a truth too close can bring. Jamila, sweeping the yard with her straw broom, looked up and froze, not out of fear of the chief, but because she sensed that this moment would bring something that couldn't be undone. The stranger was inside the house, sharpening a fishing blade. Hearing the footsteps and murmurs slicing through the air, he stepped out calmly, wiping his hands on the hem of his tunic. The chief didn't ask permission. He didn't greet anyone. He simply pointed a finger and spoke loudly, his voice like a blade. "You must leave this land. You're not welcome here. Gather your things and go before I have you removed by force." The men beside him stepped forward as if awaiting the command to act. Then for the first time, Jamila stepped between two men. She stood in front of the stranger like a human shield. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply stood there embodied, eyes glistening with the quiet strength of someone who knows they must protect more than themselves. In that simple act was the force of all the time she had stayed silent, swallowed pain, shrunk herself. Not now. Here she was a wife, and a love built in silence deserved to be defended out loud, even if only with the body. The chief looked at her with contempt. "You're standing up for a stranger. A woman like you should be thankful she even has a roof over her head." The words were spat out with the fury of someone watching power slip through his fingers. But before Jamila could answer, the stranger stepped forward. He looked a chief in the eye, not with hatred, but with the calm of someone who has waited years, and said, "You don't command me like you did my mother." The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. The men beside the chief exchanged uncertain glances. The chief himself took a step back as if he had been struck in the chest, and the stranger went on. "I know who you are, and I know what you did. I was raised far from here, but not far enough to forget the shame you left on us. My mother was expelled from this land because she got pregnant with your child. She was humiliated, silenced, discarded like trash. And you, chief, pretended you never knew her. Pretended I never existed. But I do exist. I'm here, and I didn't come to ask for anything. I came to live in peace. And it was this woman you all despised who gave me a name, a place, and a home. Jamila listened without blinking. She had never heard his story in full. She'd never known where the pain in his eyes came from. And now, in front of everyone, he let the veil fall. Their revelation was heavy like a drum on a festival night. Only this time there was no dancing, no celebration, only shame. And the chief's face, once lifted in arrogance, now looked smaller, paler, consumed by an old fear. People began to gather. Curious murmurs came from every direction. Someone said, "So it's true." Another whispered, "They always said the chief had a bastard son." The words spread like fire in dry grass that the chief tried to regain control. He raised his voice. "You have no proof. This is alien from an ungrateful man." But no one listened to him with the same respect. Because what they heard now wasn't just an accusation. It was a living story. It was pain mixed with dignity. It was a woman nobody wanted standing up for a man everyone feared down together. They revealed the rot buried beneath authority. The chief left without an answer, turned his back. He gave no order to attack, no punishment. He simply left, followed by his men in silence. And in that silence, truth began to fill the spaces once held by fear. Jamila and the stranger remained standing. They didn't embrace. They didn't celebrate. They simply looked at each other. And in that look there was everything. His stolen childhood, hair years of humiliation, their mutual choice, the love that endured, and now the truth. That day the humble cabin became the center of a moral upheaval, and on Dummer would never be the same. Because when truth rises, no title, no office, no mocking laugh can return to its former place. And there, amid the dust that had yet to settle, began the most powerful silence a village can hear. The silence of justice arriving, even if late, even if with slow steps. The drums of the village had always spoken louder than mouths. When there was an announcement, when the chief spoke, when someone important was born, the drums would speak before the words ever came. But that morning, they were silent. And the silence said more. Because for the first time in many years, truth wasn't coming from the chief or the elders, or those who had always held a voice. It came from a man from elsewhere with a buried past and a woman the whole world had been taught to despise. The news spread like fire. There wasn't a corner, market, or riverside where people weren't whispering the truth they all feared was real. He's the chief's son. His mother was banished. Jamila welcomed what the village tried to bury. Each phrase came weighted with memories, with shame, with a collective guilt. The older women said they remembered the maid, a quiet young woman with long braids who one day appeared with a growing belly and then disappeared. The chief had claimed she was sent away for stealing, but now they knew it wasn't theft. It was pregnancy. His Jamila rose early as always, but now when she stepped out with her water bucket, she could feel the eyes on her head changed. They were no longer mocking or filled with muffled laughter. Now people avoided her gaze, as if suddenly the shame belonged not to her, but to those who had scorned her for so long. The woman who had once been a joke was now a living witness to her past that could no longer be hidden. The stranger who now had a name was called Lember, his mother's name, a name once denied, a name never spoken aloud. And it was that name he now spoke with conviction. When he passed through the square, he no longer lowered his eyes. When he spoke to someone, he didn't ask permission because now everyone knew he was the chief's blood. A denied son, a silenced heir, but above all a man made whole by his own dignity. The village grew restless. The chief locked himself away for days. No one saw him in the square or at meetings. His advisors said he was sick. Others said he was confused. But the truth was simpler. Power once unmasked also falls ill. The women who once mocked Jamila now brought her sweets, fabrics, and forced smiles. But she, with the calm only pain can teach, simply thanked them and moved on. There was no revenge in her eyes. There was a rare kind of justice. The kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. And then the children, ones so quick to imitate the adults, began to come near. They approached slowly, curious-eyed, asking for stories, commenting on the embroidery patterns she stitched, offering tiny wild flowers. And Jamila, with the wisdom of someone who has been hurt too much to ever hurt back, welcomed them. One afternoon at the village market, Lember stepped onto a bench and spoke. He didn't shout, he spoke. He told his mother's story, said her name told how she was thrown out, pregnant, kicked, and threatened with death if she ever returned. He told how he grew up hearing his father's name, but never knowing his face. Told how he swore never to step foot in Andumb until he met Jamila. She gave me what no one else ever did. A place when everyone looked at me with suspicion. She saw me when no one offered me water. She gave me food in silence. And in that silence I found peace. I didn't come here to inherit anything. I came to live, and anyone who wants to expel me will have to face the truth." The square fell silent. The villagers' eyes were wet because deep down they knew. They had always known. But they pretended not to. Pretended out of convenience. Pretended out of fear. Pretended because it was easier. But now there was no pretending left. Jimmy standing beside Lear didn't shrink. She didn't wear fine clothes, didn't paint her face, didn't change her tone. She was the same. Only now everyone saw her, and they didn't see a beautiful woman by their standards. They saw a woman who with courage welcomed the unwanted, who with kindness endured mockery, who with love healed abandonment. And that's why the drums stayed quiet. Because there are truths even the oldest rhythms can't express. There are shames the beat cannot drown out. And there are loves like Jamila and Lember's that even when born of abandonment grow strong enough to silence an entire village. That day, Undumber learned that the deepest silence is not the one under a moonless night. It's the silence when truth finally finds its voice. And that voice, for the first time, had the tone of a woman everyone had rejected, and a man everyone had forgotten. But who together were making the village remember who they truly were. The village of Undumba, once so used to ignoring, mocking, and pretending, now found itself silent before a woman who had once been invisible. Jamila, who for years had been the object of ridicule, scorn, and pity, was now being seen differently. Not with fear, not with flattery, but with something entirely new to her, respect. And not because she had become rich or made herself beautiful or asked for it, but because the secret that had been revealed, the one louder than the drums, had shaken, the very roots of the Ville's collective shame. And Jamila stood at the center of that quake. People no longer passed her with their chins high. They crossed their arms, lowered their eyes, or the braver ones offered a shy greeting. "Good morning, Jamila." "How are you, Jamila?" Even the men who once laughed behind her back now avoided her gaze as if feeling the weight of the words they had once flung into the wind. The woman who used to be too big, too ugly, impossible to love was now Leaf, but she made a point to correct them. "I'm Jamila, the same as before. Only your gaze has changed." Children began to seek her out more often. They brought wild flowers, asked about her embroidery, begged for stories, and she told them not stories of kings or sorcerers, but of a girl who swept the yard while crying at dawn, of a young woman who offered food to a tired stranger, of a woman who chose not to take revenge. And when the children asked if that woman was her, Jamila just smiled and kept stitching. LEMBA intern became a steady presence in the village. He never demanded recognition, never asked for public apologies, but he walked with his head held high and did what he always did. Fished, carved, helped. Only now when he spoke, people listened. And when Jamila spoke, the village fell quiet, as if suddenly everyone had realized that dignity isn't inherited, it's built. One day, the village council of elders called Jamila to speak. A rare thing, an unprecedented thing. Women didn't sit among the old men of the village to give their opinions. But there she was, sitting with her back straight, her gaze firm, saying, "Those who tend to the pain of others don't need titles. They need courage. And if this village wants to heal, it must start by listening to the ones you're told to be." Silent, there was silence, then nods, then timid applause. Without even realizing it, people began referring to her as woman of noble blood. Not because she asked for it, but because they could no longer pretend her story was small. But whenever Jamila heard the title, she would reply with the same words. "My blood is the same, only your gaze has changed." And with that, she disarmed any attempt at hollow praise. She didn't change her clothes. Still wore the same simple fabrics with hand-embroidered flowers. Still went to the river to wash her things. Walked to the market, shared what she had. But now, when she spoke, even the arrogant listened. Because it was no longer possible to deny that what she had carried all along wasn't burdened with strength. The women of the village began seeking out in secret. Some brought cloth to embroider. Others brought half-old stories of rejected children, absent husbands, loneliness buried for decades. And Jamila listened. She didn't judge. She simply listened because she knew what it was like to have no one to tell. And there in the yard where she once swept away sorrow, now grew a space of sharing, a place of healing. Even the young people started approaching Lember. They wanted to learn how to carve. They wanted to hear what it was like to grow up with anger and turn it into honest work. And he taught without many words, just with his presence. Because those who have been denied know that the greatest lesson is consistency. Jamila, who had spent a lifetime waiting to be loved, was now heard, was sought out, was remembered. But none of it went to her head. She kept washing her cloths, tending her herb garden, offering her hand to those in need. Only now her name carried a new weight. A good weight, the weight of a woman who endured, who didn't stay silent, who chose love when all she was offered was contempt. And so quietly, without wealth, without a crown, She became something no title could bestow, an example. Because the most powerful transformation isn't the one that changes appearances, it's the one that changes the way an entire community sees. And Jamila, with her soul stitched with scars, had achieved just that. Not because she asked, but because she showed up, because she acted, because she remained. In time, Onar began to change, and that change had a name, a simple name, a name that had once been a punchline, but now it was a symbol of respect. Jamila, the woman no one wanted to hear until she became the only voice capable of healing what had long been broken in silence. The baobab tree at the center of Andumber was older than any name in the village. They said its roots knew secrets even the elders dared not tell. Beneath its wide ancient shade, the village held its most sacred rituals, the weddings of the chosen, the festival dances, the trials that shaped destinies. It was a holy place reserved for those deemed worthy of honor. Jamila never imagined she would set foot there as a bride. It was Lember who suggested it, not with pomp, not with a speech. One afternoon, while carving a wooden figure, he looked up and said, "Let's marry again." But this time, with everyone watching, Jamila paused her embroidery. She stayed silent, not out of doubt, but out of surprise. Their first wedding had taken place in her father's yard, rushed without a blessing, without a single witness, who looked at her with dignity. Now, the same man who had given her silence and constancy wanted to give her something else, recognition, not out of vanity, but out of justice. The news spread quickly, and this time there was no laughter. There was a kind of reverent buzz as if something important was about to happen. The women began preparing fabrics. The youth swept the ground around the baobab. The children gathered wild flowers. For the first time, the village moved for Jay. Not out of pity, not to mock, but because in silence everyone knew she deserved it. Jamila didn't want a new dress. She chose a simple raw cotton fabric embroidered by her own hands with the flowers she had stitched since she was a girl. Each thread carried a memory, a no she had heard, a hidden tear, a gesture of love. She dressed slowly without a mirror. She needed no ornaments, because that day she walked like a queen, not because others said so, but because she finally believed it herself. Lumber waited beneath the baobab, standing, clean tunic, steady hands, eyes fixed on her with the same quiet tenderness as always. There wasn't a crowd. There was a community. People who had once mocked her now clapped softly. People who once turned their backs now looked on with respect. People who, even without asking forgiveness, stood there to recognize what they had long denied. There was no priest, no elder's booming voice. The ceremony was led by an old woman named Makiba, long considered mad for speaking to trees and conversing with the dead. But that day she spoke to life. She said, "True love doesn't shout, it stays, and those who stay win." She placed leaves in their hands, performed the ancient gesture of entwined fingers, and said, "Now what belongs to you, the world, can no longer divide." When the drums began, they sounded different, not driven by tradition. Slower, deeper, as if they were saying, "We're learning." And the dance began. A circle formed. Jamila at the center danced with slow but steady steps. Each movement seemed to pull a bitter memory from the earth and replant it with sweetness. She danced like someone giving thanks, like someone enduring, like someone transforming. The people applauded not for beauty, but for dignity, because in that woman they saw everything they had once denied in themselves. Strength, hope, faith, forgiveness. And the most beautiful part was that Jamila didn't dance alone. Lambar stood beside her, never stealing the light, never overshadowing, just supporting as he always had, as he always would. When night fell and the fires were lit, the scent of roasted corn and peanuts filled the air. The women sang old songs, children ran around adult legs, and the elders, the very ones who once said she'd never marry, now nodded in approval. There was no luxury, no aisle, but there was truth. And truth has a way of giving everything meaning. Jamila, standing in the center of the circle, looked up at the sky. She said nothing, but her eyes said everything. "Thank you for surviving, for believing, for loving." That night, beneath the baobab, the village saw that love isn't made of appearance, status, or inherited titles. Love is made of presence, and Jamila's presence, so long denied, now shone a light not from her dress, not from torches, but from her heart. And that's how the wedding that began in silence, in mockery and suspicion, ended in reverence. Because when justice comes by the hands of love, even the drums learn to play a different rhythm. And Andumber at last began to dance to a new kind of truth. The truth Jamila had taught with her feet firm on the ground, and her soul light as someone who at last had been seen and loved as she had always deserved. As the days passed, the dust of the ceremony settled, but what had happened beneath the baobab still echoed in Andumba's memory. A village so used to pretending certain stories didn't exist, now found itself living with the lasting reminder of its own transformation. Jamila was no longer just the rejected woman who had married a stranger. She was now a symbol, a mirror that reflected what many didn't want to see. That truth, when it surfaces, changes everything it touches, even those who once tried to bury it. The old village chief, who once walked with a puffed chest and proud eyes, now walked, hunched, not just from age, but from the weight of what he had hidden for so long. Lember's words, spoken in front of everyone, had done more than expose a secret. They had opened an old wound, not only his, but the village's, the pain of a people who chose silence over justice. And now, even without formal punishment, he was a man surrounded by eyes that no longer feared him, eyes that held him accountable without speaking. Because sometimes time itself delivers the deepest punishment, the quiet kind, where authority finds no echo. Ja, on the other hand, bloomed but not out of vanity. She grew with roots. She didn't seek praise or status. She simply remained. And that in itself was revolutionary. She began welcoming other rejected women. The ones no one asked to dance. The ones who carried scars of shame. The ones who cried insolence. She taught embroidery, yes. But more than that, she taught courage. She showed through gestures what it meant to stand up after being stepped on. She showed how to stitch hope with strong thread, how to sweep the yard of the soul with a broom made of patience. Many began to follow her, not out of worship, out of gratitude. Because in Jama they saw that rebuilding was possible, and Lumber always at her side was a presence without domination. He knew that his strength wasn't in taking up space, but in protecting hers, and together they became a reference, not of a perfect couple, but a real one built on shared pain. Respected silence and love laid brick by brick with truth. In time, even the language of the village began to change. The jokes about bodies, about beauty, about who deserves to marry started to fade. People no longer said she's pretty but too fat. Now they said she has presence like Jima. Mothers told their daughters about the woman who danced beneath the bioab and taught an entire generation to look again. And the men, even the most resistant, began to understand that respect doesn't come from fear. It comes from sincere admiration. The little hut where Jamil and Lemur lived also changed. It was still simple, but now full of people. People seeking advice, seeking silence, seeking refuge. It was as if the clay in those walls held a different kind of warmth. Not from fire, but from the living story being written there. Jamila charged, nothing. She offered tea. She listened. She pointed the way. Sometimes she would simply hold someone's hand and say, "You are someone too." And that was enough, because in a world that teaches so many to hide, being seen as someone is the first step toward healing. Le never stopped either. He kept carving. His wooden figures began traveling to other villages. Outsiders came to meet the man who had reclaimed his name and used it not to dominate, but to remember. Each sculpture came with a story, and in every story there was an invisible thread that led back to Jamila. The old chief, now weakened, spent his last days sitting in the shade of the baobab. He said little, received no visitors. He was a man surrounded by the consequences of his own acts. He never apologized, but he didn't deny any more either. And for many, that was already a beginning. Some said he murmured the name of the maid, Lember's mother, at night. Others said he wept insolence. Jamila never confronted him because she knew some wounds avenged themselves, and that forgiveness when it arrives must be offered in silence, like handing a clean cloth to someone who dirtied everything. So Onar began to change, not all at once, but little by little, learning from every gesture, every choice, every stitch, every silence that was now finally being heard. And at the center of this change stood Jamila, not as a symbol, but as a seed. Because in the end she didn't overcome contempt with vengeance. She overcame it with presence, with dignity, with a love built not in the palaces of pride, but in the backyards of humility. And the lesson that remained, the one no one dare deny anymore, was simple and eternal. Sometimes the most humiliated woman is the one life chooses to teach the world what true worth really means. And when she teaches it, no one ever forgets. In the village of Onumber, time passed, but the name Jamila was never the same again. Not because she changed her clothes, nor because she rose to a place of prestige, but because her story took root like an ancient tree, the kind that withstands droughts, winds, and pests, and still offers shade to those who need it. The woman no one wanted slowly became what the village needed most. A mirror of justice without shouting, of dignity without arrogance, of love without appearance. She didn't need to seek revenge or throw the truth in the faces of those who had humiliated her. She simply lived. And to live with steadiness after so much rejection was already a way of teaching. Teaching through steps, through gestures, through silence. The man with no origin, The quiet outsider who arrived with dust on his feet and secrets in his eyes revealed without raising his voice the hypocrisy buried in the halls of power. He didn't demand reparation. He didn't seek the throne nor claim what was his by right. He simply occupied the space life gave him with respect. It was he who showed the village that dignity isn't proven with titles but with presence. And it was beside Jamila that he found the name his mother was never allowed to say in public. Lember, a name that now walked tall through the very streets that once denied it. And their love stitched together in silence, healed not only to stories. It healed an entire village. A love without spectacle, without fairy tale promises, but a real love planted in the hard soil of rejection, watered with patience and harvested in ordinary days, the way all true love should be. In the end, Jamila never needed to prove anything. She simply showed that it's possible to begin again without stepping on others, that it's possible to be strong without becoming hard, that it's possible to be loved even after being discarded. Because her love didn't wait for recognition. But when it came, it brought healing. And the village that once laughed at her expense now told her story to their daughters. Not to romanticize, but to remember that no one should be judged by appearance. That thinis cast aside today may be the cornerstones of tomorrow. And that sometimes the most wounded heart is the only one capable of offering true shelter. Jamila lived many years after the ceremony beneath the BA. She saw children grow, saw young girls become women, and whenever one of them felt small, invisible, or rejected, all it took was to sit with her in the shade of the little house, sip warm tea, hear a story, and remember that our worth isn't measured by what others say, but by what we carry inside. And what Jah carried none could ever take away. Because in the end, those who remain endure, and those who love, even when despised, transform. And that's how Ndumbumber learned to listen. Not just with ears, but with the heart. All because of a woman who only wanted to be seen, and ended up being remembered by everyone forever. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our